The first thing you notice isn't the graphics, it's the silence, or rather, it's the quality of the silence. On the PlayStation 1, silence is never truly empty. It's a thick, heavy layer of dithering and low frequency hum that feels like it's pressing against the glass of your television. When you're standing in a darkened corridor in an Alien game, you're not just playing a piece of software, you're looking through a grainy 32-bit window into a world that feels physically cold. The air in these games doesn't feel like oxygen, it feels like recycled metallic exhaust. You hear the rhythmic industrial clatter of a ventilation fan somewhere deep in the geometry of the map. It's a sound that's being compressed until it has a jagged, serrated edge to it, a quite essential PS1 sound. Then comes the motion tracker, that iconic steady ping that cuts through the hum. It's a sound that creates a physical knot in your stomach because you know that the green dot on that tiny pixelated screen isn't just a sprite. It's a predator that the hardware is struggling to render. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from 90s draw distance. The darkness isn't just a stylistic choice, it's a curtain drawn by the CPU to keep the world from collapsing. You peer into the black void, waiting for the dithering to break, waiting for the shadows to shift into the unmistakable silhouette of a xenomorph. When it finally happens, it's a blur of movement, a frantic scramble of low-poly limbs, and a piercing digital shriek that sounds like a machine screaming in pain. This is the isolation of the era. It's the feeling of being trapped in a flickering, CRT-lit nightmare, where the floor textures warp under your feet and the walls seem to vibrate with a life of their own. It's the sound of a pulse rifle reload, mechanical, heavy, and final. You're not just a player, you're a survivor in a world made of jagged edges and claustrophobic intent. Before the title screen even fades in, the PS1 has already told you everything you need to know. You are small, you are outnumbered, and the machine you're playing on is the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Welcome to the PSX Index. I'm Parasine, and this is the show where I play and document all 1,278 PS1 games released across Northern America. This episode is Index Entry 50 and 51. We are reaching a massive milestone today because we aren't just looking at a game, we are looking at the evolution of a genre through the lens of a single, terrifying license. Usually the index moves with a certain steady rhythm, but occasionally we have to pause and group titles together to truly understand the technical arc of the PlayStation. To talk about Alien Trilogy without talking about Alien Resurrection is like looking at a skeleton and ignoring the muscle. They are the bookends of the first-person shooter on this console. Alien Trilogy landed in 1996. Published by Acclaim, at the time it was a flagship, a massive 3-movie spanning epic that was meant to prove the PS1 could handle high-speed cinematic action better than any other machine on the market. It was the safe masterpiece using sprites and clever lighting to create the arcade-perfect experience. It was the game that convinced a generation of players that they didn't need a high-end PC to hunt xenomorphs. Then we have the anomaly, Alien Resurrection. Released in the late 2000s, it arrived at a time when the PS1 was supposed to be a legacy system. While the rest of the world was looking towards the emotion engine of the PS2, Argonaut Games stayed behind to see if they could do the impossible. They threw away the 2D sprites of the mid-90s and built a full 3D survival horror shooter. It practically broke the hardware it was running on. It introduced a way of moving and looking that the industry at large wouldn't accept for another year, making it one of the most misunderstood and ahead of its time's titles on the entire 1,278 game library. By the end of this episode, we're going to understand how the PS1 grew up. We are going from the fast-paced sprite-shredding chaos of the early entries to the slow, suffocating dual-analog tension of the console's twilight. This is a story of how a grey plastic box went from being a toy to a machine capable of genuine, high-fidelity terror. One represents the height of 90s polish, the other represents a technical revolution that arrived just a moment too late. It's time to clock in. We have a lot of hallways to clear.
Alright, understand this. The Bioweapons Division had orders to eliminate anyone who attempts to interfere. Obviously, they won't be aware of your team's mission.
Ripley.
Access the computer system. Security codes. We're in. Stay frosty, people.
To understand the weight these games carried, you have to look at the landscape of the mid-90s. In 1996, the PlayStation wasn't the established titan it eventually became. It was still a hungry upstart trying to prove that CD-ROM technology was the future of the mature entertainment. Alien Trilogy arrived at the absolute perfect moment. We were in a post-Doom world where every developer was scrambling to find the next killer app for the first-person genre. On consoles, this was usually a mess of pixelated compromises, but Alien Trilogy felt different. It was a blockbuster. In the UK, the marketing for Trilogy was inescapable. It graced the covers of every magazine from Play to Total PlayStation, often accompanied by those gritty, high-contrast renders of a xenomorph that looked impossibly detailed in print. Acclaim hyped up their modern capture technology as if they'd discovered fire, promising that the movement of the aliens would be indistinguishable from the films. For a teenager in a Range Street British suburb, these weren't just games, they were the closest thing we had to an R-rated cinema experience in our bedrooms. It was the era of dark gaming, where the industry was shredding out its colourful, mascot-driven skin and embracing something colder and more cynical. Then there is a long quiet shadow cast by Alien Resurrection. If Trilogy was the celebratory launch of the era, Resurrection was its exhausted finale. By the time it finally hit shelves in the late 2000s, the cultural context had shifted entirely. The movie it was based on had come and gone 3 years prior, a diversive, slimy experiment that many fans were already trying to forget. The game itself had spent nearly 4 years in development hell at Argonaut Games, a studio with a pedigree for technical wizardry that had somehow lost its way in the transition to 3D. Argonaut was the studio that gave us the Super FX chip and Star Fox. They were the smart kids of the industry, but Resurrection broke them. It started as an overhead shooter inspired by Loaded, then pivoted to a third-person Tomb Raider clone, before finally settling into the first-person perspective we see today. By the time it arrived, the PlayStation 2 was already out in Japan and North America. The original PS1 was no longer the cutting edge, it was the budget choice. Alien Resurrection felt like a transmission from a dying world. It was a game that refused to accept the console was over, delivering a level of visual fidelity and a control scheme that looked towards a future the hardware wasn't supposed to be part of. It's the difference between the 1996 dream of interactive movies and the 2000s reality of a hardcore survival horror. To understand the technical leap between these two entries, you have to look at the math of the PlayStation. In 1996, Alien Trilogy was a masterpiece of efficiency. It used a 2.5D engine, the kind of tech that powered Doom. The hallways are 3D, but every xenomorph, every facehugger, and even the pulse rifle in your hands is a flat 2D sprite. Probe Entertainment knew the PS1 struggled with the complex polygon counts, so they cheated. They used billboarding, where these flat images always turn to fascia, creating the illusion of volume. Because the console didn't have to calculate thousands of polygons for every enemy, it could fill the screen with movement. It's why Trilogy feels so frantic. The hardware has the breathing room to throw a dozen sprites at you without the frame rate dropping into a single digit. They mask the simplicity with the heavy use of Divid-coloured lighting, bathing those sprites in deep reds and sticky greens to hide the pixelated edges of the 1996 assets. By the time we reach Alien Resurrection in 2000, the alchemy has shifted from cheating to brute force. Argonaut Games decided to throw away the sprite safety net and go full 3D. Every xenomorph is a textured, articulated model on a machine with only 2 MB of system RAM. This is essentially a suicide mission for the developer. Argonaut developed a proprietary engine that pushed the PlayStation's CPU to its absolute breaking point. They introduced a real-time lighting system that allows for shadows to dance across the environment as you move your flashlight. It's so technically demanding that it creates a time and dependency within the hardware's architecture. This leads to one of the most infamous technical glitches in retro gaming, the door bug. If you try to play Alien Resurrection on a PlayStation 3 or a standard emulator, the internal clocks often don't sync perfectly to Argonaut's aggressive code. Because the game is racing the hardware to render everything in time, the script for opening a door can simply fail to trigger. You'll walk up to a key-coded door, hear the sound effect, and nothing happens. You are literally locked out of the game because the modern machine is too fast or too imprecise to handle the tightrope walk Argonaut was performing in the 2000s. It was a game that was coded so close to the metal of the PS1 that it effectively became part of the silicon. But the real magic trick is the textures. Usually, PS1 games suffer from texture warping, where the floor looks like it's a liquid swimming beneath your feet. Argonaut used a technique called sub-pixel precision to keep the world stable. When you look at the USM Eureka in Resurrection, it doesn't look like a PS1 game. It looks like an early PS2 title. They achieved this by sacrificing quantity over quality. You rarely fight more than 2 aliens at a time, but those 2 aliens are more complex than anything we saw in the first 5 years of the console's life. It is the ultimate example of late-gen wizardry, taking a console everyone thought was a known quantity and forcing it to perform one last impossible miracle. One of the most rewarding parts of this 1278 game marathon is the moment you realise a modern masterpiece didn't actually invent its best ideas, it just remembered them. While playing Alien Resurrection, I hit a moment that felt so modern it gave me chills. It's the chest bursting mechanic. In most shooters of the era, if a facehugger hits you, it's just a flashy animation and a chunk of health gone. In Resurrection, it's a death sentence. If one of those spinally pale parasites successfully latches onto your face, you aren't just hit, you are impregnated. You'll hear a sickening squelch, and from that moment on, a literal timer begins to tick inside your body. If you don't find a specialised surgical machine in time, the creature gestates, and it's a game over in the most visceral way the PS1 can manage. It forces you to play with a level of frantic biological desperation that I haven't felt in a game in years. This leads into a broader discovery. Alien Resurrection is the true mechanical ancestor of Alien Isolation. We often think of Isolation as the revolutionary break from the action shooter mould, but the DNA is right here in 2000. In Resurrection, the aliens aren't just cannon fodder, they are predatory AI. I discovered that they don't just run at you in a straight line, they use the 3D geometry to flank you. I've had moments where I was staring down a dark corridor, pulse rifle ready, only to realise the motion tracker was beeping because the alien had climbed onto the ceiling and was crawling behind the light fixtures to get a better angle on me. This kind of environmental awareness from an enemy was practically unheard of on the PS1. It turns the game from a test of reflexes into a test of spatial paranoia. There's also a fascinating bit of trivia I stumbled upon regarding the game's identity crisis. I never realised that Alien Resurrection was originally meant to be a top-down isometric shooter, almost like a high-end version of Alien Syndrome or Loaded. When that was scrapped, it became a third-person Tomb Raider clone, where you played as a high-poly Ripley crawling through vents. It was only in the final stretch of its 4-year development hell that the team at Argonaut decided to go first-person. That new discovery explains why the levels feel so much more architectural and real than a standard FPS. They were built to be looked at from a distance, which is why the scale of the USM Eureka feels so much more oppressive and cavernous than the boxy rooms of Alien Trilogy. Finally, I noticed the subtle detail of Trilogy that I had completely overlooked as a kid. The game actually attempts to bridge the gap between all 3 movies in a way that creates a weird, Ripley-centric mythology. You play as Ripley across level 426, the prison on Fiorina 161, and the derelict ship. but the game treats it as one continuous nightmare military operation. It's less of a movie adaptation and more of a what-if scenario where Ripley became the ultimate corporate janitor. Discovering these narrative shifts from the arcade heroics of Trilogy to the biological horror of Resurrection makes you realise that the Alien franchise was used by developers to figure out what horror actually meant in a 3D space. It wasn't just about the jump scares, it was about the threat you couldn't see, even when the motion tracker was screaming that it was right in front of you. This is where the reality of retro gaming hits home. Playing Alien Trilogy today is like trying to win a track race while wearing concrete boots. Because it arrived in early '96, it was designed for the original digital-only PlayStation controller. There are no thumbsticks here. You move with the D-pad, but the D-pad doesn't just move you, it rotates you. If you want to strafe, which is essential for surviving a hallway full of spitting xenomorphs, you have to use L1 and L2. This creates a disjointed, tank-like rhythm to the combat. You aren't flowing through the environment. You are stop, starting, pivoting and shuffling sideways like a crab with a pulse rifle. It's an exercise in 90s frustration that makes every encounter feel much more desperate than it probably was intended to be. You don't aim at a facehugger. You sort of suggest a general direction and hope the game's generous vertical auto-aim decides to play ball. It's clunky, it's stiff, and it's a physical reminder of a time when we were still figuring out how to inhabit a 3D space with only 4 directions of input. Then you switch to Alien Resurrection and you hit the single most controversial moment in the history of the first-person shooter. This game didn't just support the DualShock, it mandated a revolution. Argonaut Games implemented the twin-stick control scheme, left stick to moving straight, right stick to look and aim. To us in 2026, this is as natural as breathing. It is the universal language of console gaming, but in 2000, critics absolutely revolted. The review from GameSpot is legendary in its misjudgment, calling the controls unplayably difficult and terrifying. They literally couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of moving and looking independently. One reviewer famously complained that they would constantly find themselves staring at the ceiling or the floor while an alien hacked away at them, simply because they weren't wired to use the sticks at once. Playing it now, you feel like a time traveller. You are using the correct controls for the time in the index, but you're doing it on a controller that wasn't quite refined for it yet. The sticks on a PS1 DualShocks are a bit too tall, the tension is a bit too loose, and the dead zones are massive. It makes the movement in Resurrection feel incredibly heavy. Ripley doesn't glide, she trudges. Every step feels like you're wading through molasses, which only adds to the claustrophobic dread. In Trilogy, the physical struggle is against the D-pad's limitations. In Resurrection, the struggle is against the sheer weight of the simulation. There is a tactile exhaustion to Resurrection that Trilogy avoids. In Trilogy, you're playing an arcade game. You're tapping buttons, shredding sprites, and moving on. In Resurrection, you are constantly wrestling with the camera, squinting through the darkness, and trying to maintain your composure while the right stick betrays your panic. It's the moment where playing a game turns into operating a survivor, and the industry was so startled by the change that it almost rejected the very controls that would eventually define it. It's a physical bridge between the digital past and the analog future, and crossing it is one of the most jarring experiences of the entire 1278 game journey. Even though they share the same license and the same great plastic housing, they are philosophically opposed. Alien Trilogy is a what-if power fantasy. It's the version of the Alien universe where Ripley isn't just a survivor, she's a one-woman army. It leans heavy into the James Cameron school of thought. If it bleeds, we can kill it with a larger gun. The game is built around speed, body counts, and satisfying arcade loops. You feel capable. You have a grenade button that, as I discovered, actually predates the Halo standard of dedicated explosive mapping. You're clearing rooms like a space marine. and the horror is secondary to the thrill of the hunt. It's a game that asks, how many aliens can you kill before the timer runs out? Alien Resurrection pivots so hard it'll give you a neck strain. It abandons the power fantasy entirely and returns to the suffocating dread. In Resurrection, you aren't a soldier, you are the prey. The game slows everything down. You spend more time staring at your motion tracker than you do looking through your iron sights. This is the pivot point of the episode, the moment where the first person shooter on the PS1 stopped trying to be Doom and started trying to be Resident Evil. It's a shift from action to survival, where the single encounter with a xenomorph isn't an obstacle, it's a traumatic event. The pivot is best represented by how the game handles their environments. In Trilogy, the levels are game levels. They are mazes designed for a high-speed shoot-em-up, filled with colour-coded keycards and armour pickups that defy logic but make for great gameplay. In Resurrection, the US Amora feels like a real place. The corridors are cramped, the lighting is intermittent, and the rooms have function. You aren't clearing a map, you are navigating a derelict ship that feels like it's actively trying to kill you. It's fascinating to see the PS1 handle the transition. In 1996, the console was all about the wow factor, fast sprites, big explosions, and CD music. By 2000, the wow factor had matured into the atmosphere factor. We traded the high-speed thrill of Trilogy's smart gun for the shaky handheld flashlight of Resurrection. We moved from a world where aliens were cardboard cutouts waiting to be shredded, to a world where they are 3D predators hiding in the geometry of a dying machine. It's the ultimate midpoint realisation. Trilogy taught us how to play, but Resurrection taught us how to be afraid. And as we head into the second half of this index entry, that fear is exactly what we're going to dissect. If you were to strip the visuals away and listen to these games through a pair of high quality headphones, you would hear two completely different interpretations of the future. Alien Trilogy is a symphonic masterpiece. Its soundtrack is a sweeping architectural tribute to the James Cameron era of the franchise. It's loud, it's cinematic, and it's meant to pump your adrenaline. The PS1 CD-DA audio capabilities are on full display here. The music doesn't just sit in the background, it drives the pace of the game. Every time you track new swells with those military brass sections, the game is telling you that you are the hero of an action movie. But even within that bombast, there is a PS1 grit. The sound effects, the pulse rifle, tat tat tat, the hiss of those doors, the screech of a dying xenomorph, have that slightly muffled 22 kHz compression that makes everything sound industrial and heavy. It's the audio equivalent of a scratched VHS tape, and it works perfectly to ground the sprite-based action into a world that feels official. Alien Resurrection, however, treats sound as a weapon used against the player's sanity. It abandons the orchestral score of the minimalist ambient soundscape that leans heavily into a cassette futurism. Most of the time, the only thing you hear is the low, thrumming vibration of the ship's hull and the distant metallic groans of a dying vessel. This is where the PS1's sound processing unit shines in a way that modern hardware often overcomplicates. The audio is sparse, which makes every individual noise a potential threat. When you hear the wet, skittering sound of an alien moving through a vent above you, the lack of music makes that sound feel hyper-real. It's not a sound effect layered over a track. It's a localised event in the silent, terrifying void. The star of the show in both games, but for very different reasons. It's the motion tracker. In Trilogy, the ping is a rhythmic comfort. It's part of the HUD, a steady heartbeat that lets you know the arcade action is functioning as intended. But in Resurrection, the motion tracker is a physical object Ripley holds in her hand. It emits a soft green glow and a piercing directional beep. Because Resurrection uses the PS1's ability to simulate a 3D audio space, that beep is the only way to navigate the darkness. You'll find yourself spinning in circles, trying to isolate whether that ping is coming from the corridor you left or the ceiling directly above your head. There is a specific kind of audio jank in Resurrection that actually enhances the horror. Because the PS1 has a limited number of sound channels, the game will sometimes cut to prioritise a sudden loud noise, like an explosion or a xenomorph scream. This creates those jarring, silent voids that feel like the world is glitching out under the pressure of the terror. It's a technical limitation that mimics the feeling of a sensory blackout. In Trilogy, the sound tells you that everything is under control. In Resurrection, the sound tells you that the ship is falling apart, your equipment is failing, and something is breathing right behind your neck. It's the most efficient use of the PS1's audio limitations I've encountered in the first 50 entries of the index. The term friction in a game's design often refers to things that slow you down, but in the mid to late 90s, friction is usually just a polite word for disrespecting the player's time. In Alien Trilogy, the friction is purely administrative. It's not that the game is too hard or the enemies are too smart, it's that the mission objectives were designed by someone who clearly enjoyed a good spreadsheet. Every level has a kill quota, or an objective percentage. You can fight your way through a grueling labyrinth hive, reach the exit elevator with a sliver of health left, and find the door locked. Why? Because you only killed 58% of the aliens and the game demanded 60%. This forces a tedious backtracking mop-up operation. You have to wander through the empty grey corridors you've already cleared, looking for that one stray facehugger or a single missed crate to tick a box. It's a design philosophy rooted into the arcade era, where longevity was faked by making the player repeat their steps. It turns a cinematic horror experience into a janitorial simulation. You aren't Ripley, the saviour of humanity. You're Ripley, the middle manager checking off a list of extermination targets. It creates a disconnect where the tension of the Alien license is constantly undermined by the gameness of the objectives. Alien Resurrection, however, offers a much more violent kind of friction. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most punishing games of the PlayStation 1. The friction here is rooted in a total lack of resources and a save system that feels like it's actively rooting for your demise. You are given very little ammo, your health is a fragile suggestion, and the xenomorphs are relentless. But the true friction, the thing that makes you want to bite your controller, is the darkness mechanics. In 2000, Argonaut decided that immersion meant you shouldn't be able to see more than 5 feet in front of your face. You have a flashlight that flares, but they operate with a limited battery that drains with agonising speed. This creates a loop where you are constantly wrestling with the settings of your actual television, trying to find a brightness level where the game is playable without ruining the vibe. It's a physical friction, a battle between the developer's artistic vision of a pitch-black ship and the player's basic need to see the geometry of the room. When you combine this with the aforementioned twin-stick learning curve, the game becomes a mountain of resistance. It doesn't want you to move through it, it wants to stop you. It's the ultimate late-era friction, where the developers were so focused on pushing the hardware to its atmospheric limit that they forgot to make the experience fun in a traditional sense. It's brilliant, it's beautiful, and it's absolutely exhausting to play for more than an hour at a time.
Will all non-essential personnel please report to lifeboats?
When we talk about the legacy of these two games, we're really talking about the missing link between the evolution of a first-person shooter. Alien Trilogy represents the peak of the old standard. Its developer, Probe Entertainment, was eventually swallowed up by the corporate machine of Acclaim, becoming Acclaim Studios. For a brief moment in the mid-90s, they were the kings of the licensed tie-in, proving that a movie game didn't have to be a rushed piece of shovelware, but Trilogy was also a dead end. It perfected the style of sprite-based action just as the world was moving towards the polygonal future. It remains a beloved relic, a game that everyone seems to remember having on their shelf, but one that didn't leave a lasting mark on how games were actually built. It was a victory of polish over innovation. Argonaut Games and Alien Resurrection occupy a much more tragic space in the industry's void. This was a studio that quite literally taught Nintendo how to do 3D with Star Fox. They were the technical elite, yet Alien Resurrection became their Icarus moment. The game's legendary 4-year development cycle meant that by the time it finally arrived to show off the revolutionary dual-analog controls and real-time lighting, the party was already over. It was a technical masterclass delivered to an empty room because it was released so late in the PS1's life, and because it was so brutally difficult. It was largely ignored by the mainstream and panned by critics who weren't ready for its control scheme. The real tragedy is that the Resurrection engine could have been the foundation for the next 5 years of console shooters. Instead, the industry looked elsewhere. We had to wait for Halo on the Xbox for the twin-stick setup to be vindicated, and we had to wait for Alien Isolation to see a developer treat the Xenomorph with this much predatory respect again. Argonaut themselves would eventually struggle. Closing their doors in 2004, they left a game that acts as a lost blueprint. When you play Resurrection today, you aren't just playing a PS1 game, you're playing a vision of what a 32-bit era could have been if the hardware just had a little more RAM and the audience had just a little bit more patience. It sits in the void because it doesn't quite fit anywhere. It's too advanced for the PS1, yet too lo-fi for the PS2. It's a ghost in the machine. While Trilogy is celebrated in best of PS1 lists for its nostalgia and tight arcade gameplay, Resurrection is often relegated to a technical footnote. But for those of us going through a full 1278 game index, this is where the real history is buried. It's in those late game experiments where the developers were most desperate, most creative, and most willing to break the rules. Trilogy gave us a great game, but Resurrection gave us a glimpse into the future, even if it had to die in the dark to do it. When you stand back and look at these games as a single entry in the index, you realise that they represent the two sides of the human psyche when faced with a nightmare. Alien Trilogy is the response of the late 90s, aggressive, loud and confident. It's a game that believes if you just have enough ammunition and a fast enough frame rate, you can conquer the dark. There is a strange, comforting honesty in its design. It doesn't try to be anything other than a high-octane celebration of a cinematic icon. It treats the PlayStation as a vessel for entertainment, a way to translate the thrill of the big screen into something you can control with a D-pad. My reflection on Trilogy is one of pure, unrefined nostalgia. It is the sound of my childhood, a time when horror was something you could blast away with a well-timed grenade. Alien Resurrection, however, is the response of a more mature, perhaps more cynical era. It's the realisation that some nightmares can't be beaten, they can only be survived. It treats the PlayStation not as a toy, but as a laboratory. Argonaut Games wasn't trying to make you feel like a hero, they were trying to make you feel like a victim of a technical marvel. Philosophically, it is a much more important game. It's the moment the index stops being a list of fun things to do on a Saturday and starts being a record of how we learn to simulate fear. It's a game that respects the intelligence of the player by refusing to hold the hand, even if that meant falling into the void of a commercial failure. There is a poetic irony in the fact that the better game to play in a social setting is undoubtedly Trilogy, yet the one I think about when the lights are off is Resurrection. One is a masterpiece of the era's limitations, while the other is a masterpiece that tried to ignore those limitations entirely. As I played through them, I felt a deep sense of respect for the sheer variety of the PS1's library. To have two games based on the same property feel so fundamentally different is a testament to a time when the developers had the freedom to experiment, to fail, and to reinvent. In the grand tally of 1,278 games, these two act as a vital pulse check. They remind us that the progress isn't a straight line. Sometimes we move from perfection to an old idea to the messy, broken birth of a new one. And while Resurrection might be the one that gives me a headache after 40 minutes of wrestling with darkness and difficulty, it's the one that makes me glad the Index exists. It's a reminder that even in the bargain bins of the late-gen failures, there are sparks of genius that define everything we play today. We are looking at the transition from the game to the experience, and that is the transition that changed the industry forever. We've survived the Hive, two very different versions of the same nightmare, locked into the Index forever. One sprite-based, one 3D, one arcade power fantasy, one suffocating survival experiment. Both are essentially understanding exactly what the PlayStation was capable of at the start and end of its life. If you're looking for a fast, twitchy shooter that celebrates the greatest hits of the Alien franchise, Trilogy is your game. It's the sound of 1996 in all its dithering, orchestral glory. But if you want to see the PS1 scream in agony as it tries to render a 3D xenomorph crawling across a ceiling in a dark hallway, you have to experience Resurrection. That's two more entries documented and shelved. The mountain is tall, the hallways are dark, but we are making steady progress through the history of the grey box. 51 games down, 1,227 games to go. In our next episode, we're trading the cold vacuum of space for the asphalt of the adrenaline of the extreme sports craze. We'll be looking at the ESPN Extreme Games bundle, covering the complete Extreme trilogy, 1 Extreme, 2 Extreme and 3 Extreme. It's a dive into the heart of the 90s extreme culture, the evolution of the combat racer, and the moment Sony decided that rollerblading and street luge were the future of sports. I'll see you at the starting line for Index entries 52, 53 and 54. Get your skates on.